Okay then. Where are we now? Good evening, everybody. And let me just get my papers together and we can get started on this.
You have to list
Attendance list, yes. Just a minute now. Can you remind me of that a little bit later on? We'll get to that. I'm sure it's here somewhere. Oh yeah, here it is. And okay, so right. Well, I want to talk about the specific role that the Bible had in shaping attitudes towards suffering. But before I do that, I want to look at the kind of more general cultural background. Hi, come on in. Yeah, that's okay. I think there are two bits there. Okay. So we just need to look a little bit at the sort of society, what kind of society, what kind of culture we had going on here. It's pretty fundamental, really, that the world we live in now is very different in certain respects, and particularly this whole attitude towards the fact that if you're alive, you suffer. Okay, you get ill, you stub your toe, ouch. Okay, it's inescapable, but. In the early modern period, they had a kind of different attitude towards it that compared with the way things are now. In our world, suffering is, as far as possible, kept kind of out of the way. And people, even if it's going on, people don't talk about it. It's a kind of taboo thing, really. If people are suffering, then they're kind of tucked away in hospitals. We don't kind of have them wandering around the streets suffering as far as possible. Suffering is, as far as possible, it's kept away from the public gaze. But that was very different in the early modern period when suffering was on public display. I'm not saying I'm not saying you're going to see people with arrows sticking out of them, like that. But basically, the whole attitude towards suffering was very different from ours, and I'd just like to look at the kind of cultural background to that. The ubiquity of suffering. Ubiquity basically means the everywhereness. Okay, the fact that it was everywhere, that it was everywhere you look. It could be anywhere, which of course it can be even today, but it's just like. My mother lived until recently in a little village called Rottingdean, and I'd go shopping when I was in England. I'd go to the shops and I'd pass this street, Whipping Post Lane. Goodness gracious, what a name to give a street, okay? But of course, there's no whipping post there now, but there would have been. Even probably up until the 19th century. There would have been something possibly like this, which is made out of stone and still standing in the village of Ripple in Worcester. And next to it you can see another pleasant little contraption for locking people's feet so that they couldn't move, and they'd be kept trapped in that position, and people would come and throw things at them, like rotten eggs, if you were lucky, stones if you were unlucky. So very public and very unpleasant. And that would be there in every village, in every town. It would be something that you'd see. So suffering was sort of all around. You'd see something like this. This is a pillory where people's head arms would be kept, and offenders, again, they'd be publicly humiliated by being forced to remain in something like that for, I don't know how many hours or something like that. The fact that there are two here and that it's raised up off the ground, it looks like it's something to shame adulterers, people who slept, somebody who slept with someone who wasn't his wife. They'd catch them, they'd put the two of them up on the top of that pedestal and on that platform there, and people would come and sort of shout things at them and abuse them and throw things at them. This is the kind of society that we've been talking about. This is the kind of society that Shakespeare was living in. All right, it's an undercurrent to everything we've said so far about, you know, that society with the Bible and everything. This was the way they lived. Okay, this was what they did. You'd have public whippings and things like this, people being stripped to the waist, beaten, and that really, you know, although by the time you get to the 19th century, the early 19th century, it didn't often happen. It still was on the law books. It wasn't actually taken off the law books until 1827. In this case, particularly nasty punishment, where a Quaker was whipped through the streets, tied to the back of a wagon. The wagon moves forward and he's pulled through the streets and he's being whipped all the way. And then when they get him to a certain point, they tied him to a post and cut his tongue out. Sorry, it's very unpleasant, but I think we have to kind of cope with this. We have to see this to understand what's going on in this sort of society. You've got this public punishment. You've got beggars being whipped through the streets. We talked about the closing of the monasteries, and that you know that meant that a lot of the kind of charitable organisation that the monasteries provided left beggars with no support once the monasteries were gone. So homeless people, well, we're not particularly kind to homeless people in our society, but we don't whip them through the streets. Okay, so this is from the 1530s. Okay, around about the time that the monasteries were being closed. So you've got it kind of going all through this period, 16th, 17th centuries. You've got all kinds of levels of severity. Here's a group of women who are being hanged because they were accused of being witches. Okay, this is in the 17th century, the second half of the 17th century. So this is going on all through this period. There's all this brutality, and there was what needs to be emphasized here is that it wasn't just the brutality, it was the fact that it was a spectacle. It was something for people to go and watch, to go and see. I mean, even in the 19th century, they were having public hangings. They actually built special railway lines in certain cases to the places where the hangings would happen because it was such a popular event. And if you had such an appetite for seeing suffering, you could go to the pleasant spectacle of animals being tortured. Okay, bear baiting was one of the favourites. Queen Elizabeth was a keen attender of bear baiting events. Bear baiting would be where you set a number of dogs onto a bear and you bet money how many dogs can the bear kill before the dogs kill the bear. Okay, so this was the kind of society that we're dealing with. Okay, this was the kind of society that Shakespeare was living in. You know, you wonder why they needed the theatre. You wonder why they needed all that kind of tragedy going on the stage. There's enough going on in real life, you think. So, yeah, suffering was going on publicly, unnecessarily. I mean, you know, if people are sick, they're sick. But I mean, all of this is stuff that people are doing to each other. They don't have to be doing it, you know. And it's going on in that society. The other thing is the inescapability, the inevitability of suffering. Medicine was much less advanced than it is in our day. Everybody would sicken, everybody would die. And so there was this constant reminder of the fact that we suffer. No anesthetics, no painkillers, dental surgery. It was bad enough going to the dentist now, okay? But imagine them doing it with no anesthetic, nothing to stop the pain. Things were pretty brutal. All right, you just have a pincer stuck in your mouth and yank the tooth out. All right, that would be that. So. Yeah, we can see that, for example, we look at an operation by the famous diarist Samuel Pepys, probably the most famous member of my college. There's a Pepys library there still today and everything. He had a bladder stone removed from a sensitive part of his anatomy. And Claire Tomalin, who writes a lot of biographies of people of this period, he's asked to position himself on a table while the process of binding him up began. They had to tie him down, okay, because of the pain. The binding was terrifying to many patients. They would truss like chickens, their legs up, a web of long linen strips wound around their legs, neck and arms. When it was done, the patient was further bound to the table, and on top of the binding, a number of strong men were positioned to hold him fast. So on top of the binding, you had people to hold him in position. Meanwhile, the surgeon lubricated his instruments with warm water and oil or milk of almonds. There were no anesthetics, nothing to stop the pain. Alcohol was certainly not allowed to a patient undergoing surgery to the bladder. There was nothing at all to alleviate the pain. The surgeon got to work. First, he inserted a thin silver instrument through the penis into the bladder. Then he made the incision about 3 inches long. The stone was sought, found, and grasped with pincers. Once out, the wound was not stitched. It was thought best to let it drain and cicatrize itself, so that they'd let the blood flow and let it dry naturally. Pepys, no doubt by now fainting with shock and pain, was unbound and moved to his warmed bed. It is hardly possible, it's difficult even to read that, isn't it? To think about it, imagining it happening to you, and taking a look here, if your eyes can stomach it, at these were instruments for doctors to use on people in those days. They would just do it, okay? They would just use these things on people with no medication, nothing to stop the pain, all right? I know it's a bit difficult to watch, okay, but I want to bring it home to you. I want to make it real, okay? So another area in which, you know, suffering would be kind of a big thing was childbirth. Of course, you know, I don't know if you've noticed it, but if you've studied the history of this period, they're often saying so-and-so had 10 children, 2 of whom survived into adulthood. It was very typical for babies to die. It was also quite a risk for the mother as well. Mothers often, or at least not infrequently, would die in childbirth or shortly after. So it pleased God in much mercy. Sorry, I'll take that back a bit. It pleased God, this is from the diary of Alice Thornton, okay? It pleased God in much mercy to restore me to strength to go my full time, so to complete my labour. My labour beginning 3 days, but I fell into exceeding sharp travail in great extremity. I was in a lot of pain. So the midwife did believe I should be delivered soon. I should have the baby quickly. But lo, it fell out contrary. It didn't happen like that. For the child stayed in the birth. It wouldn't come out. And came cross with his feet first. And in this condition continued till Thursday morning between 2 and 3 o'clock, at which time I was upon the rack. I'll just bring up that expression there, upon the rack. I'll come back to that. In bearing my child with such exquisite torment, as if each limb were divided from other for the space of 2 hours. When at length, being speechless and breathless, I was, by the infinite providence of God, in great mercy, delivered. I'll come back to the language of that as well. But I, having had such sore travel, it meant hard work. Okay, it didn't mean journey, going on a journey. In danger of my life so long, and the child coming into the world with his feet first caused the child to be almost strangled in the birth, only living about half an hour, so died before we could get a minister to baptize him, although he was sent for. So, after all that pain, the child dies. Let's just look at the language there. I was upon the rack. Now, the rack was an instrument of torture used to force people to tell the truth about things, and it was something like this. They'd be tied with ropes, and their bodies would just be stretched. It was called the rack. In particular, for a woman at that time, the image would be of Anne Askew, who was a noble woman, and because of her social class, it had never happened to anybody of her social class. In fact, she was the only person to be both tortured and burned at that time, and it was under the time of Henry VIII. She was extremely brave. She died without giving the names of the other people that she was. All they were doing was they wanted to have a different idea of the Bible, and Henry didn't agree. Okay, and he wanted to know who they were, and she refused to tell, so she was put on the rack and tortured in this way, and that's the language that's being used in that diary for birth, okay, on the rack, and that would be the image that would be in her head. But you see, she's doing it for God, all right? That's where we're going to bring it round here to biblical stuff, but let's wait for it a minute. Let's just get the ideas clear here. I was upon the rack. Okay, it brings to mind this suffering for God of the martyrs. And then, as I said, I come back to a little bit of the other language here. By the infinite providence of God. We talked a little bit about providentiality, providentialism, the idea that God is there sorting things out for the best. But how, in the middle of all that pain, how can she be saying, that this is the infinite providence of God? And in great mercy, she talks about the mercy of God. It seems like a horrible thing that's happening to her. And yet, she's seeing it as the providence of God. She's seeing it as an example of God's mercy. She's not complaining. In fact, she's quite kind of, she sees it as a kind of privilege to be in that sort of position. All right, so I think, there's something here that would be very... I don't think we'd meet somebody who thought like that in this world today, or very difficult to meet anybody who thought like that. But this was not uncommon in those days, to think about your suffering in that kind of way. So, okay, early modern attitudes towards suffering and the way they thought about suffering then was obviously, quite different from the way we see things today. We've got Alice Thornton here. It was her 5th child. And after all that suffering, the child died. And 2 of her previous children had also died. And yet, in spite of all of that, she's talking about the infinite providence and the great mercy of God. And she's not just accepting her suffering, but she's apparently glad that she had the opportunity to suffer in that kind of way. All right, and this is what I'd like to explore and kind of show how it relates to, well, partly necessity. When there wasn't anything, you had to. There was nothing else that you could do. You had to suffer when these things came around. You didn't have any choice about it. So naturally, they had a different attitude towards pain and suffering from ours, because we do have choices. Okay, not completely, but to a certain extent. So she thinks about her suffering in a very, very different kind of way from the way that most people would think about suffering today. So now I want to tie that in with like the Christian teaching and the Bible and that sort of thing. In early modern times, this way of approaching suffering, not just as something to be accepted, but as something to welcome and even be grateful for, was not necessarily unusual. Because to the early modern mind, first thing you have to understand is suffering would never be meaningless. And we see it as, that didn't have to happen. You know, but they would always see it was meaningful. There was always a meaning to suffering. There were two meanings to suffering. There was always a purpose to it. Either it was to punish the wicked, or it was to purify the good. Suffering in this world had a purpose in their mind. They wouldn't see it as, oh, that was just an accident, or, oh, what a shame that happened. They would say that's part of God's plan. That's part of an intention. Either to punish the evil or to purify the good. All right? So suffering really is central to the kind of early modern way of looking at the world. If we can understand this, then most of everything else falls into place. An early 18th century translation of a Spanish Catholic writer puts it, you must all suffer either following Christ or forsaking him. Whether you follow Christ or whether you don't follow, you're going to suffer either way. You might as well suffer going the good way as suffering the bad way, because you're going to suffer either way. There's no escaping the suffering. Okay, so then we've got these Christianity with its ideas about suffering, and behind that we've got the classical world. Remember, this with the Reformation is something that's going on inside Christianity, but you've also got, at the same time as the Reformation, you've got the Renaissance, which is the rebirth, supposedly, of classical ideas, classical philosophy. And in the Greek and Roman times, the Romans ended up Christian, but until then they were not Christian and they were following their own religion. They had their philosophy, and inside their philosophy there were two main branches that looked at the idea of pleasure and pain and, you know, how we enjoy or don't enjoy this life. And those were called Stoicism and Epicureanism. All right, we still talk about these today. We don't necessarily use them exactly the way the Romans did or the Greeks. In fact, we use them rather differently. But these ideas were going on in the ancient world. So what's happening in the 16th, 17th centuries is they're trying to bring all three of these together in a certain way. Let's try and get some sort of understanding of what's going on here. So the early modern period was not just a time of religious reform. It was also the time of the Renaissance, the revival of the classical culture of ancient Greece and Rome. That was going on at the same time. So the early moderns were trying to create some sort of synthesis between classical philosophy and the teachings of the Bible. They wanted to try and tie these things together as much as they could. And so you've got these two schools of philosophy, the Stoic school and the Epicurean school, and these were, they particularly talked about suffering and pain and pleasure and, the whole kind of that side of our experience on this planet. So they wanted to try and make sense of all of this in a certain way. Now, Stoicism, kind of didn't really fit altogether with the Christian ideas. What am I saying? Stoicism, neither of them fits perfectly with the Christian ideas, but the Stoic idea fits more closely. Because, well, firstly, you've got the idea that the mind can control the body. And it can become indifferent to pain and pleasure. If you kind of develop yourself enough, you won't feel pleasure, you won't feel pain. You'll be a Stoic, a perfect Stoic. Whereas the Epicureans, they would say, no, suffering is evil, and the natural thing to do in life is to avoid suffering, and pleasure is the absence of suffering. Now, This Epicurean idea is the one that philosophically doesn't really fit with Christianity. The Stoic idea doesn't fit perfectly, but it fits better. Let's try and explore that just a little bit to understand the kind of philosophical background. The Epicureans thought it was natural to avoid suffering, whereas the Stoics thought that what you could do is just make yourself so you didn't feel either suffering or pleasure. You got beyond pain or pleasure. But the Stoics, they realized that certain pleasures are going to make you suffer. Like if you get drunk today, you're going to have a hangover tomorrow. We pay for our pleasures. And undertaking to suffer could sometimes lead to a future pleasure. I mean, in our modern world, one of the few areas where people can legitimately suffer is in training for a sports event or something like that. They can suffer and they can suffer, but then they win the competition. Everybody says, "Well done, Yoko Ganbari Mashita." You know, it's sort of, the sporting world is one of the few areas where people can legitimately suffer in our modern world. People would see it pretty strange if you said, "I'm suffering so that I can go to heaven," but you can suffer to win a race. Okay, that would be okay. So, just a minute now, where are we? This is the problem with the sort of philosophy of Christianity. The Epicurean view of pleasure sees it as the absence of pain. So that suggests that the thing, the entity, the thing, the existing thing is pain. And when pain goes away, then you can have pleasure. Pleasure is the kind of anshin that you experience when you're not experiencing pain or suffering. Well, Christianity says no. According to the Bible, everything was made by God. And everything that was made by God was good. Okay, so from the Christian point of view, pain and suffering don't really exist. Because they weren't made by, they're not made by God. They're not part of the world that God made. And since God made everything, okay? So from the Epicurean point of view, pain and suffering are evil, and we have to drive out pain and suffering in order to experience pleasure and happiness. So pain seems to be a thing, and pleasure is the kind of absence of that thing. And pleasure is not a thing in itself, but just an absence of pain. The Christians say all things were created by God, everything God created is good, pain and suffering came into the world by sin. All right? It's because humans did bad things that made pain and suffering come into the world. Before that, they wouldn't have existed. So pleasure and happiness are part of the good world that God created, and they are things. Pain and suffering are not part of God's creation, so they are not things. They're a kind of illusion we've created for ourselves through sin. Something like that. Okay, so the Epicurean way of thinking didn't really fit very well with the Christian ideas of the 16th and 17th centuries. And so Stoicism came to be the one that the 16th and 17th centuries most kind of got stuck onto and kind of accepted. It was basically seen as the kind of patient acceptance, patient endurance of suffering. And that was, during most of the early modern period, that was what they mostly kind of accepted the idea of. They believed in the Stoic idea. And this would apply to Catholics as well as to Protestants, really. And Epicureanism was being seen more as something like hedonism or pleasure-seeking. You know, just Stoicism says, well, I avoid suffering and I go towards pleasure. I avoid pain and I go towards things that make me feel good. Okay, so you're kind of running away from the bad side and running towards the pleasurable side. So it's sort of pleasure-seeking. It's not actually what Epicureanism is all about, but that's how they saw it. And that's how we tend to see it now. If we call somebody an Epicurean, we mean, oh, you're a pleasure seeker. And if we say to someone, you're a Stoic, we mean, oh, you're a kind of gamangzuyoi kind of person who accepts everything and never complains. And so it was more accepted the Epicurean idea became more accepted in the kind of, well, from the middle of the 17th century on as the Enlightenment, what we call the Enlightenment got started. We'll talk about the Enlightenment later on. The Enlightenment is when we move away from believing, society moves away from believing in things like witches. Society moves away from this idea of a kind of personal God who is saying, yeah, every time you suffer pain, it's me, you know, I'm either trying to purify you or punish you. It moves away from seeing the world in that kind of way. And it becomes more kind of logical, scientific, pragmatic, more like the world we're living in now for most people. So it's Stoicism that really wins the day in the early modern period. Stoicism with its patient endurance of suffering. And that brings us right back to, you know, the Bible. This is Job in the Bible. Specifically in the book of Job, the devil says to God, you know, there you think he's a good man, and he praises you, and look at him down there, look at him, this little human, you know, but it's easy for him. You know, he's never had it tough, he's never had a bad time, it's easy for him. Let me make it hard for him, let me make him suffer. And let's see if he continues to be a good servant of God when he has to suffer. Okay? And Job is patient through all his sufferings. Job accepts that he has to suffer, and he continues. And in the end, God says, okay, thank you, you've done enough now, Mr. Devil. I'm God, and I'm going to say the game ends now. And Job gets his life back, and he's blessed even more than before. He's got more cows than he had before. He's got more wealth and riches than he had before. God is very pleased with him because he came through all that suffering without complaining. So Job would be very much an example of that kind of stoical approach to suffering. You can see it in the Bible. So you get in the 17th century, you get this kind of shift. In the earlier part of the 17th century, this is that kind of Job and the patient acceptance of suffering, the Stoic idea, and that's the purpose of life. And then, you know, as the 17th century goes on, and you get into the Enlightenment, you got more of people sort of saying, well, but isn't it okay? We're in this world. What's wrong with enjoying it? You know, you might as well, you know. And so the idea that, so you know, and of course, by the time you get to you know, American, you know, Bill of Rights, you know, the right to happiness is written in there. Okay, in the 18th century, humans have a right to the pursuit of happiness. So those ideas are growing up from the second part of the 17th century onwards and becoming enshrined in the American kind of constitution in the 18th century, and become part of what we accept as normal, you know, in this world today. Well, just to see all of that pictorially, let's take a look at Hieronymus Bosch's very famous painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights. And this is, you know, it's before the Reformation, but it really says it all. We'll very often find that art expresses these things before they become, you know, written down in text. Before they become kind of part of historical process. Art seems to anticipate where things are going. So you can look back at this art that's from before the early modern period, and it really sort of sums up the way of thinking that they had in the early modern period. On the first panel here, on the left-hand side, you've got you've got sort of the world of Eden, the world of paradise, but yet, you know, it goes against the Bible because it's showing in the Bible that animals are all vegetarian at that time, but they're not here, are they? You know, and there's some things that look very pretty and lovely, like these unicorns drinking at the water here. There are these uncomfortable things creeping out of the water here. What's going on? And the way that God gives Adam Eve has often been discussed by art critics. It's almost like, he knows what's going to happen. Here you are, have her. I know what you're going to do. You're going to mess it all up. Okay? And then, of course, you've got all these strange things going on in the foreground of the picture. Okay, so yeah, you've got it's almost as if God, as he gives Eve to Adam, he knows where this is going to lead. It's going to lead into the garden of earthly delights. It's going to lead to the pursuit of pleasure, the pure pursuit of pleasure, to the exclusion of morality, to the exclusion of everything else, which is the main central panel of the picture. Okay, this panel here, where you can see pretty much every form of lovemaking, sexual interaction, weird behavior of pretty much every kind, naked people gallivanting and cavorting around, and that's kind of the garden of earthly delights. All right. Okay, so the pursuit of pleasure to the exclusion of all else. All right. Which, of course, is going to have to be paid for. Okay, there's this sort of economy. You pay for your pleasures. So the right-hand panel shows where all of that ends. It ends in sort of endless pain, endless humiliation, ugly scenes of knives cutting flesh, and a sort of circle of, well, you can see sort of rods being stuck through people, people being locked up, people being cut with knives in all sorts of horrible ways, people being digested, okay, and excreted and kind of recycled, so they're going to be taken round to be eaten and digested and recycled again and again and again and again in a sort of unending cycle of misery and horror. It's a sort of unending horror show. And that's basically, how the early moderns were seeing their world. I mean, I'm not saying everybody saw the world like that, but that was the kind of prevailing paradigm. That was how people saw it. If you go for pleasure in this life, you're going to be paying for your pleasures. Okay? So Bosch kind of gives it all to us there. Okay, I've talked you through the picture, but here's some text to go with it. He painted his triptych some years before the Reformation, but the economy of suffering, the idea that we pay for our pleasures, was part of a tradition. As I say, both Catholics and Protestants would be part of that basic tradition. And then, the idea that we pay for our pleasures, well, that carries with it the opposite side, that we can be rewarded for our suffering if we suffer in the right way. So we pay for our pleasures, but we can also, providing we suffer in the right kind of way, we can be rewarded for our suffering. And that's the other side of what we call the economy of suffering. This is an important idea for Catholics and Protestants, but the way they went about it, the way they put that into practice, would be different depending on their religious convictions. So Catholics would follow, as we talked about before, the penances, the ascetic practices that were believed to please God, and things like fasting, going barefoot, kneeling, wearing a hair shirt, which was a sort of hair shirts and sackcloth, like, uncomfortable stuff and self-whipping and this sort of thing. And it goes right back to our friend Jerome, who, remember, it was he who translated the Bible. It was his Bible that was used for 1,000 years. He lived the ascetic life of a hermit. He was famous for his fasting. He's famous for his penances. And he is the one who gave the Catholic Bible, the Jerome Bible that was used for 1,000 years. He was the one who gave the world that particular translation of the Bible, with its emphasis on penance rather than repentance. And you've got Dura, again, King David in the Bible, the same sort of thing. Dura showing King David performing penance by whipping himself. So that's in the Psalms, that's in the Old Testament of the Bible. So it really depends on how you look at the Bible and understand it. But although Jerome was probably wrong about the way he translated that penance rather than repentance, there certainly are examples of active, things like acts of penance going on in the Bible as well, where people are sort of punishing themselves for doing bad things. But, we've seen this, I'm just emphasizing the point that Protestants denied that you could please God in this way, and you had to repent rather than do penance. So the correct way to heaven was you'd feel sorry for the sins in your heart, not by punishing your body. And that was the very first point that Luther made in his 95 Theses. And, yep, it was serious enough to die for. Okay, if you're going to have to be burned for something, you might as well be burned for that, because it was worth it. Which brings us to fate and free will again. If people's names were written in this book of life that we talked about before, they would have no influence on whether they went to heaven or not. They would be predestined to go to heaven or hell. I'll go through this fairly quickly because we have talked about this. Catholics believe they could increase their chances of going to heaven by prayer, by good works, and so on, but Protestants didn't believe it. And they did accept the idea that prayer and good works would be a sign that somebody was going to go to heaven, because after all, you'd expect good people to do good things. But they did deny that these outward acts could change your fate. Your fate was a matter of faith, not of the works or the actions, the activities that you engaged in. So penances were especially frowned on by most Protestants. The only one that was sort of allowed up to an extent was fasting, because that was showing that you weren't guilty of the sin of greed. So moderate fasting was okay, but most other penances, no. So from a Protestant point of view, the important thing was having faith in your salvation, not trying to earn bliss in heaven by making yourself suffer. So you weren't allowed to make yourself suffer. On the other hand, a life of pleasure, okay, you've got to think this through, because this was a sort of obsession for them. I know I'm repeating a certain point, but think about what that means. You're not allowed to make yourself suffer. On the other hand, if you're having a life of pleasure, you're going to go to hell. All right? So it put the Protestants in a very difficult kind of psychological position. It led to depression and so on. We'll talk about that. We'll see that as well later on. So being chosen to suffer for Christ's sake was a sign that you were destined for heaven. You were chosen to suffer. That's, we look at that woman giving birth. That's why she's so happy about it. She's being chosen to suffer. Say, thank you, God. You're giving me a sign, that I'm going to go to heaven. That's the way she's seeing. So people not only suffered, they rejoiced to suffer. They were glad to suffer. They were happy to suffer. Well, Sounds weird, okay? But that's, they would see it in this economy of suffering, that they were suffering now for a future benefit. It didn't mean that suffering wasn't important, just because you couldn't choose to suffer. You had to be chosen, just as you had been chosen from the beginning to go to heaven or hell. You would have been chosen to suffer. And if you weren't chosen, then it was a sign that you were going to go to hell. So one of the surest signs that you were chosen, that you were of the elect, that you were predestined to heaven, was to be given the opportunity to suffer for Christ's sake. And to be given such an opportunity, you didn't just have to suffer, you had to rejoice to suffer. Because if you're just suffering, then you're going to feel, well, I'm just suffering. It's just it's just part of my punishment before I go to hell, and I'll be suffering like this all the time. But if you feel this is purifying me, this is part of my path to heaven, you rejoice to suffer. So this would cause tremendous anxiety to people. The early modern period was the period when kind of first books on anything we could that resemble psychology was starting to be written. Because if they weren't suffering, then that meant they were going to suffer, after they died, they were going to go to hell. If they were suffering, but they weren't actually rejoicing to suffer, that is, if they couldn't feel thankful that they were suffering, then their suffering would just be a foretasting of the eternal suffering of hell. So, to put it simply, they didn't just have to suffer, they had to suffer and enjoy it. Okay? That's where we're going to have to leave them pretty much this week. Okay, I think there might be, I can't remember quite how much more I've got here. Suffering, because I actually am having to, this is the last section now, and next week we're going to kind of complete this area of study and move on to slightly less heavy stuff, okay? But just to finish this up for this week, how does that all come and relate to the Bible? Well, in the Geneva Bible, this rejoicing to suffer is expressed like this. I'm using the Geneva Bible because that's what would have been the one around at the time. We rejoice in tribulations, knowing that tribulation bringeth forth patience. So tribulations means, hard experiences, difficult experiences, suffering, basically. In the King James's Bible, it would be, we glory in tribulations, also knowing that tribulation worketh patience. So they say very much the same thing there. And in Acts, Christ's apostles are described as rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name, his being Christ. Okay? They were happy. The Romans got us, and the Romans gave us a bad time. Oh, that was good, because we were counted. God thought it was. We were worthy of suffering for Christ. So if you're going to follow that path, that's what you have to do. But you can't do it to yourself in the Protestant way of thinking. It has to happen. Okay, we're going to look at what that leads to next week, but or even perhaps just in some extent what I'll move on to in the second half of the lesson. So let's go back to that then. It pleased God in much mercy to restore me to strength. You see, it pleased God in much mercy. All right, God was doing her a kindness to restore me to strength to go to my full time, giving her the strength to complete her suffering. Right? She knows that her suffering comes from God because he gave her the strength to carry on. Right? So she sees this as, this is good, he's choosing me. I fell into exceeding sharp trail in great travail, in great extremity, so that the midwife did believe I should be delivered soon. It fell out contrary, the child stayed in the birth, came out cross with his feet first. In this condition continued till Thursday morning. And I was upon the rack bearing my child with such exquisite torment. Now in modern English the word exquisite means something like delightful, tanoshi. I would be pushing it if I said that she's saying tanoshi, in this case, because in early modern usage, it just meant very strong or very. It doesn't necessarily mean delightful in the way that we use it, exquisite today. But it's not a negative word. She's her torment is not. She's not putting a negative word for it. It's exquisite torment. It's great, but she can bear it. She can stand it. Which means, in her way of thinking, that shows that it's the providence of God. It's God's mercy that's bringing her this suffering. Okay? So it pleased God in much mercy. All right? And I was upon the rack. And I was, by the infinite providence of God, in great mercy delivered. So the way she's seeing this, I think maybe it makes, when you first saw it at the beginning of the lesson, you might have thought, well, that's pretty weird. I hope it makes a bit more sense, how she's looking at life, how she's seeing it, in order to think about it in that way. Not just to say, oh, I had a terrible time giving birth to my fifth child, but seeing it as this was an opportunity for me to really feel that I was chosen by God. And the fact that the child dies doesn't seem to put her off at all. Okay? She was strong enough to handle that terrible pain, and she feels that the strength came together with the pain from God. And it was part of testing her, just like God tested Job in the Bible. It's the same sort of stoic approach to suffering.